The air inside the arena of the Three Vows tasted like ozone and ancient dust. It was a cold that did not just sit on the skin, it bit through fabric, through muscle, and settled deep into the marrow of Cyprian Voss's bones. He stood in the center of a circular pit carved from obsidian, his standard-issue Terrasol mechanical coveralls looking pathetically orange against the oppressive black stone. Across from him stood Archon Xylia. She was a vision of lethal elegance, her sapphire skin shimmering under the artificial ultraviolet lights of the stadium. In her hand, she balanced a gravity lance, a weapon that could flatten a human's ribcage with a single pulse of its kinetic core. "Is this the part where I yield and we go get a very large drink?" Cyprian asked, his voice cracking. He tried to adjust his grip on a heavy, blunt training staff he barely knew how to hold. Xylia did not blink. Her eyes, voids of pure darkness with only pinpricks of starlight for pupils, tracked the frantic pulse in his throat. "You invoke the soul-binding human? You chose the path of the mate? Now you must endure the vow of the sinew, or you die." Cyprian let out a jagged breath. "My mother always said my social anxiety would be the death of me, but I did not think she meant it so literally." As Xylia shifted her weight, the stadium erupted in a cacophony of rhythmic drumming. Thousands of Cryosian warriors, their armor clanking in unison, cheered for the inevitable slaughter of the small, soft creature in the pit. His mind flashed back to 48 hours ago. The galactic accord on the frozen moon of Eon 9 had been a disaster from the second the coffee machine in the human delegation's lounge decided to explode. Cyprian, who had been hiding in the maintenance closet to avoid the suffocating tension of interstellar politics, had been summoned to fix it. He was a sanitation and life support engineer, which in the eyes of the high and mighty Terrasol diplomats meant he was a glorified janitor with a wrench. He had been elbow-deep in the machine's thermal coils, muttering curses at its substandard wiring, when the heavy blast doors of the Grand Concourse had groaned open. The Cryosian hegemony had arrived. They did not walk. They marched, a sea of blue-silver giants in obsidian plates that absorbed the light of the room. At their head was Xylia. She had marched straight to the center of the hall, slammed her gravity lance onto the floor, and demanded a blood-tithe duel from the youngest delegation present to prove their worthiness for peace talks. Ambassador Miller had gone pale, his gaze darting around for a champion we did not have. Earth was the new kid on the block, a collection of scrap collectors and hopeful dreamers who had only recently discovered the Echo Drive. We were not warriors. Cyprian had stepped out of the lounge, wiping grease from his forehead, just as Xylia's predatory gaze swept the room. She had called him out, her voice a resonant boom that made the crystals in the chandelier vibrate. "Step forward, champion of the small ones. Face the archon of the hegemony." Cyprian had frozen. He was 32 years old, had a chronic fear of public speaking, and his only combat experience involved a particularly aggressive recycling drone in Sector 7. But Miller was trembling, and the soldiers of the Cryosian Guard were already priming their lances. "I am not a champion," Cyprian had stuttered, stepping into the light. "I am just the guy who fixes things." Xylia had loomed over him, a full head and a half taller, her presence a crushing weight of history and violence. "Then prove your mettle, fixer. Draw your blade." Time had slowed down. Cyprian saw the silver braid of her hair swaying. He saw the ritual scars on her neck. He saw the sheer, unadulterated coldness of a culture that had forgotten the meaning of a soft touch. He did not think. He reacted. As she raised her lance for the ceremonial strike, Cyprian did not reach for a weapon. He stepped inside her guard, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out and wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing his face against the cold, hard obsidian of her breastplate. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a vacuum. A hug. He had given the most dangerous woman in the known universe a genuine, desperate hug. On Earth it was a gesture of comfort. To the Cryosians it was the tactile surrender, an ancient and nearly forgotten rite where a soul acknowledges its match and offers its life in exchange for union. Now standing in the arena of the Three Vows, Cyprian realized he had traded a quick death at a peace summit for a slow, agonizing one on a warrior planet. Xylia moved. She was a blur of blue and silver, The gravity lance swung in a wide arc, the air humming with lethal energy. Cyprian didn't try to block it. He knew his staff would snap like a toothpick. Instead, he dropped to the floor, rolling through the freezing dust of the pit. The lance passed over his head with a sound like a whip crack. "You are fast for a dust muncher," Xylia remarked, her voice devoid of emotion as she pivoted for a second strike. "But the vow of the sinew does not reward cowardice. Stand and fight." "Fight?" Cyprian panted, scrambling to his feet. "I am an engineer, Xylia. I don't break things. I find out why they are broken and I fix them." "The systems of your body are about to be broken beyond repair, Fixer," she countered. She lunged. This time there was no room to roll. Cyprian saw the tip of the lance glowing with violet light. He did the only thing a systems engineer would do. He looked for the interface. The gravity lance was a marvel of Cryosian engineering, but it had a visible heat sink on the side of the handle, glowing a faint red as it recycled the kinetic energy of the swings. As the lance came down toward his shoulder, Cyprian didn't move away. He moved closer. He took the blunt end of his staff and jammed it directly into the cooling vent of the lance. The weapon sputtered. The violet light flickered and died as the safety overrides engaged to prevent a thermal meltdown. Xylia froze, staring at her inert weapon. "What did you do?" she hissed. "I disrupted the thermal feedback loop," Cyprian gasped, his lungs burning. "Your tech is impressive, but it's got a 60-degree blind spot in the ventilation cycle." The crowd in the stadium fell silent. No one had ever sabotaged an Archon's weapon during the vows. High Prefect Volt, watching from the royal box, stood up, his indigo face twisted in a snarl. "This is an insult. The human uses trickery where there should be blood." Xylia looked up at Volt, then back at Cyprian. Her starlight pupils seemed to widen, just a fraction. "He found the flaw," she said, her voice carrying across the arena. "He did not use strength. He used understanding." She dropped the lance. It hit the obsidian floor with a heavy thud. "The first vow is complete," she announced. "The human survives." Cyprian collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking. "I really, really hate this planet," he whispered to himself. He did not see the way Xylia looked at him, not as a victim, but as a puzzle she had yet to solve. The transport ship, known as a void sledge, was a brutalist spike of black metal that cut through the vacuum of space like a splinter. Inside, the walls were lined with the trophies of 1,000 conquests, the skulls of silicon-based lifeforms, the tattered banners of fallen star empires, and rows upon rows of stasis pods containing the honors of the dead. Cyprian sat on a bench that was far too hard for human comfort, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline of the arena. Across from him, Xylia sat in perfect, motionless silence. She had replaced her gravity lance with a ceremonial dirk sheathed at her thigh. "Why?" she asked abruptly. Cyprian blinked. "Why what? Why did I sabotage your lance? Or why did I hug you?" Because honestly, both felt like a good idea at the time. Xylia leaned forward, the ultraviolet lights of the cabin casting deep shadows across her features. "Why did you not bring a champion? Your people knew the risks of the accord." Cyprian let out a dry laugh. "Archon, my people are trying to figure out how to grow wheat on Mars without it tasting like rust. We don't have a warrior caste. We have teachers, doctors, and people like me who make sure the air filters don't clog up with recycled sweat. We thought the summit was about talking, not stabbing. A civilization without warriors is a civilization waiting to be erased," Xylia said, but there was a strange lack of conviction in her tone. "Maybe," Cyprian said, leaning back against the cold wall, "but a civilization that only knows how to stab eventually runs out of things to feel." The door to the cabin hissed open, and Reen, Xylia's shield-sworn protector, stepped inside. The massive warrior looked at Cyprian with a mixture of pity and confusion. "Archon, the High Prefect, demands a briefing. He is displeased with the outcome of the first vow. He believes the soul binding should be nullified." "He cannot nullify the ancient law," Xylia snapped, standing up. "The tactile surrender was witnessed by the ancestral loom. To break it would be to invite the madness of the void upon our lineage." "Volt does not fear the void as much as he fears change," Reen muttered, casting a quick glance at Cyprian. Xylia turned to Cyprian. "Stay here. Reen will ensure your safety." Do not touch anything. The ship's systems are attuned to Cryosian neural patterns. If you interface with the wrong console, it will fry your primitive nervous system in 3 seconds. Got it, Cyprian said, raising his hands. No touching. I'll just sit here and contemplate my life choices. As the doors closed behind Xylia, Cyprian didn't sit still for long. He couldn't. His mind was wired to see the architecture of things, and this ship was screaming at him. There was a low-frequency hum vibrating through the floorboards, not the steady thrum of a fusion reactor, but something erratic, like a heartbeat suffering from an arrhythmia. Rian watched him with one hand on his belt. You are a strange creature, human. You possess no armor, yet you walked into the den of the High Prefect. I'm Voidborn, Cyprian lied, using a bit of slang from the deep space mining colonies. We don't have room for fear when a leaky valve can kill 100 people. You just get used to the pressure, Rian grunted. The pressure here is different. Volt wants war with your coalition. He sees your system as a soft target, a collection of resources guarded by children. He wanted you to die in the pit so he could claim Earth violated the sanctity of the duel. So I'm a wrench in his gears, Cyprian mused. You are more than that, Rian said, lowering his voice. You are the first outsider to survive a vow in 300 years. The warriors are whispering. Some say you are a sorcerer. Others say you are simply too stupid to know when to die. I'll take too stupid for 50 credits, thanks, Cyprian muttered. He stood up and walked toward the back of the cabin, where a large pulsating crystal was embedded in the wall. It was the ship's primary echo drive interface. As he drew closer, the erratic hum grew louder, turning into a faint, mournful wail that vibrated in his teeth. Cyprian frowned. He knew he wasn't supposed to touch anything, but his fingers were already twitching. That sound. It wasn't mechanical. It was the sound of a system in pain. What is that? He asked, pointing at the crystal. That is the spirit of the vengeance, Rian said, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper. It is the digitized consciousness of Admiral Scar, one of our greatest tacticians. He guides the ship's aim. Digitized? Cyprian asked, his stomach turning. You mean you trapped a dead guy's brain in a box to steer your boat? It is the highest honor, Rian insisted. To serve the hegemony even after the flesh fails? It sounds like he's screaming, Rian. The warrior stiffened. You hear it? Only those with high neural sync can hear the echo. Cyprian didn't answer. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the crystal. He could see the microfractures in the lattice, the way the energy was being forced through channels that were never meant to handle that much load. The Cryosians were powerful, but they were brutal. They treated their technology the same way they treated their people, with demands of absolute obedience and zero regard for the cost. Suddenly, the ship groaned. A massive jolt sent Cyprian flying against the bulkhead. Red lights began to strobe throughout the cabin, and a high-pitched alarm began to blare. Hull breach? Cyprian yelled, scrambling to find his footing. No, Rian growled, checking his wrist comm. Sabotage! The engine is redlining. Volt! That bastard is trying to scuttle the ship with us on it. Cyprian didn't wait for permission. He lunged for the echo drive console. Xylia said it would fry my brain, he thought, his hands slamming onto the crystal interface. But a fried brain is better than being a smear of atoms in deep space. The world exploded into white light. Cyprian wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was in a vast, dark cathedral of data. Streams of silver light flowed around him like rivers of mercury. In the center of the void stood a towering figure made of flickering code. Admiral Scar. The figure was wreathed in chains of black energy, its face twisted in an eternal, silent scream. Release me! The voice echoed in Cyprian's mind, a billion voices crying out at once. I can't release you yet, Admiral, Cyprian thought, pouring his own neural energy into the interface, using the meditation techniques he'd learned as a conflict mediator. But I can fix the feedback loop. Just breathe with me. Sync your frequency to mine. He began to visualize the ship's systems as a complex plumbing network. He saw the clogs, the pressure spikes, the points where Volt's agents had injected malicious code to overload the reactor. With the precision of a master engineer, he began to reroute the flow, his mind working at speeds no human should be capable of. Outside in the physical world, Xylia burst into the cabin just in time to see Cyprian Voss glowing with an intense, blue light, his hands fused to the echo drive. "Get him away from there," she screamed, drawing her dirk. "It'll kill him." "No!" Reen shouted, holding her back. "Look at the monitors. The reactor is stabilizing. He's talking to the ship." Slowly, the red lights faded. The mournful wailing turned back into a steady, rhythmic hum, a heartbeat that was finally in sync. Cyprian collapsed, his hands sliding off the crystal. He gasping for air, his nose bleeding, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. 5,000 credits, he wheezed. "I'm charging 5,000 credits for that repair job." Xylia knelt beside him, her expression a chaotic swirl of shock, fury, and something that looked suspiciously like awe. "You touched the echo drive," she whispered. "No human has ever survived the neural link." "I've had worse hangovers," Cyprian lied, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he slipped into unconsciousness. Xylia looked at her protector. "Reen, cancel the briefing with Vault. Tell him the Archon is busy tending to her betrothed." "And Reen?" "Yes, Archon. Prepare the palace for the vow of the intellect. It seems our fixer has more than one way to break our world." As the void sledge approached the obsidian spires of Creus Prime, the silence between the two species was no longer just filled with coldness. It was filled with a new, terrifying possibility that the small, soft creature from Earth wasn't just a mistake. He was a catalyst. And catalysts, as every engineer knows, are the only things that can change the state of a system forever. The recovery suite in the Citadel of Echoes was less of a hospital room and more of a high-tech freezer. Cyprian Voss lay on a slab of levitating obsidian, his body wrapped in translucent blue membranes that pulsed with a rhythmic, numbing chill. Every time he tried to shift his weight, a sharp spike of pain reminded him that 3 of his ribs were currently held together by little more than Cryosian prayers and advanced medical gel. He stared up at the ceiling where holographic representations of historical battles played out in a silent, endless loop. It was the Cryosian version of daytime television, he assumed, and it was doing wonders for his growing sense of existential dread. A hiss of pressurized air announced the opening of the door. Cyprian didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. The heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots was unmistakable. Archon Xylia walked to the side of his bed, her presence immediately sucking the heat out of the already frigid room. She wasn't wearing her full combat gear today, opting instead for a sleek, dark tunic that showed the intricate silver etchings of her victory scars. "You are awake," she observed. Her voice was as neutral as a vacuum. "The medical cast reported that your neural pathways survived the echo drive interface, though they remain scorched. You are a biological anomaly, Cyprian Voss." Cyprian let out a breath that came out as a puff of white mist. "Nice to meet you too, Xylia, and thanks for the flowers." "Oh, wait, you don't have flowers on this rock. Thanks for the cold slab of rock, then." Xylia tilted her head, her starlight pupils narrowing. "You use humor to mask your fear. It is a primitive defense mechanism. My father believes it is proof of your species' inherent instability. He thinks you are a glitch that needs to be scrubbed from the system before you corrupt the hegemony." "Well, your father sounds like a real ray of sunshine," Cyprian groaned, wincing as the blue membrane tightened around his chest. "But he is not entirely wrong. I am terrified. But on Earth, we have this crazy idea that being scared doesn't mean you are weak. It just means you are paying attention." Xylia reached out, her long sapphire fingers hovering just above the medical gel. "Why did you save the ship? You could have let the reactor redline. You could have escaped in a pod while the Vengeance turned into a small star. Volt's agents would have been blamed, and your coalition would have had their pretext for a full-scale mobilization." Cyprian looked her in the eye, the sarcasm momentarily drained from his face. "Because there were 400 people on that ship, Xylia. 400 living, breathing souls who didn't deserve to be vaporized just because some high prefect wanted to play God. I don't care about pretexts or mobilization. I'm a systems guy. When I see something that is about to break, I fix it. That is the only rule I live by." Xylia was silent for a long time. The holographic battle on the ceiling shifted to a depiction of the siege of Valenus Prime, where thousands of Cryosian soldiers had charged into a plasma storm to claim a single ridge. It was a glorious, meaningless sacrifice. "You fixed the Admiral as well," she said softly. "Scar, he has been quieter since you interfaced. The technicians say the Echo Drive is running at 99% efficiency. They have never seen such harmony between a pilot and the ghost." "He's not a ghost, Xylia. He's a person who was shredded into bits of code and told to work for eternity without a coffee break. He's tired. He's angry. I just gave him a moment of peace. If that is what your people call harmony, then your music must be terrible." Xylia pulled her hand back, her expression hardening. "You talk as if empathy is a currency we can afford to spend. In the hegemony, to feel for the enemy is to invite the blade. To feel for the machine is to lose your edge. We are a sharpened blade, Cyprian. That is how we have survived for 10,000 years. And blades eventually go dull," Cyprian countered, "or they snap." The door hissed open again, and Reen stepped in, looking uncharacteristically tense. "Archon, the Council of Elders has convened. They are skipping the traditional rest period. They want to proceed with the vow of the sinew immediately." Xylia stiffened. "He is injured. The medical gel has only been active for 6 hours. The protocol requires 48. High Prefect Volt has invoked the clause of emergency," Reen said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "He claims that if the human is strong enough to interface with an Echo Drive, he is strong enough to stand in the pit. He wants to see him break before the rumors of his miracle spread any further. The ice bloods in the lower sectors are already calling the human a spirit talker. Volt wants to prove he is just meat." Cyprian struggled to sit up, the obsidian slab humming as it adjusted to his movements. The pain was a white-hot needle in his side, but he pushed through it. "Well, I've always wanted to be a martyr. Though I was hoping it would involve more cake and less blue goo." "You cannot do this," Xylia said, turning to him. Her dark eyes were unreadable, but for the first time, Cyprian thought he saw a flicker of something that wasn't coldness. "Volt will not send a warrior this time. He has authorized the use of a sledge guard." "What is a sledge guard?" Cyprian asked, rubbing his face. "It sounds like something I'd use to drive a stake into the ground." "It is a semi-autonomous combat unit," Reen explained, his hand tightening on his belt. 7 feet of reinforced carbon fiber and hydraulic pistons. It doesn't feel pain, it doesn't tire, and it doesn't yield. It is used for clearing minefields and suppressing riots in the slave pits of the Outer Rim. It is a butcher's tool. "So Volt is sending a literal machine to kill the guy who fixes machines," Cyprian muttered, a grim smile playing on his lips. "That is some top-tier irony right there. Give the man a medal for dramatic structure." Xylia grabbed his shoulder, her grip firm. "Yield, Cyprian. When you enter the pit, before the guard is activated, invoke the rite of infirmity. You will lose your standing, the soul binding will be severed, and you will be deported back to your coalition. You will live." "And what happens to Earth?" Cyprian asked, and staring at her. "What happens to the peace talks if the champion of the small ones runs away with his tail between his legs?" Xylia looked away. "Volt will declare the humans faithless. He will launch the obsidian dirge." "Then I guess I'm not yielding," Cyprian said. He swung his legs over the side of the slab, the pain making his vision swim for a second. "Reen, do me a favor. Find me a heavy-duty magnetic wrench and about 3 meters of copper wiring. If I'm going to a butcher shop, I might as well bring my own knife." The arena of the three vows was packed even tighter than before. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable sense of bloodlust hanging in the frigid air. High Prefect Volt sat in his high chair, his indigo skin looking almost black in the shadows. He looked down at Cyprian with a smirk that said he had already written the obituary. In the center of the pit, the sledge guard waited. It was a terrifying piece of engineering, a hunched, faceless mass of matte black metal with 4 hydraulic limbs that ended in jagged, crushing pincers. It didn't breathe. It just emitted a low, mechanical hum that resonated in Cyprian's teeth. Cyprian stood at the edge of the white circle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was dressed in his orange coveralls again, though they were now stained with medical gel and his own blood. In his right hand, he held a massive, scarred magnetic wrench. In his left, a coil of copper wire. "Look at the grounder," a voice jeered from the stands. "He thinks he's going to fix the sledge." Cyprian ignored them. He was looking at the sledge guard's leg joints, specifically the hydraulic fluid lines that ran just behind the knee plates. The herald's horn sounded, a deep, mournful blast. The sledge guard hummed louder, its optical sensors glowing a dull, angry red. It lunged with a speed that defied its massive size. Cyprian didn't try to block. He moved like a man whose ribs were on fire. Clumsy, desperate, but focused. He dived to the left, the guard's pincers slamming into the obsidian floor where he had stood a millisecond before. The impact cracked the stone, sending shards flying. "One," Cyprian whispered, counting the seconds. The machine recalibrated, its torso spinning 360 degrees to track him. It swung a massive arm in a horizontal sweep. Cyprian dropped flat on his stomach, the wind from the blow ruffling his hair. He felt a rib pop, and he had to bite his tongue to keep from screaming. 2. The sledge guard paused for a microsecond, the standard reset time for its target acquisition subroutine. Cyprian scrambled up and through the coil of copper wire. It wasn't a weapon, it was a tether. He aimed for the spinning gears of the machine's shoulder. The wire snagged. The guard, sensing a foreign object, tried to rip it away, but the wire was caught in the high-torque rotation. It began to wind tighter and tighter, pulling the machine's own arm into an awkward, self-tangling angle. The crowd went silent. This wasn't combat. This was sabotage. Volt stood up, his face contorted. "Destroy him!" The sledge guard let out a screech of grinding metal. It ignored the tangled arm and lunged again, its remaining 3 limbs working in a frantic, uncoordinated scramble. It was like a wounded insect, twice as dangerous because it was malfunctioning. Cyprian waited. He stood his ground as the 7-foot monstrosity bore down on him. At the last possible second, he didn't dodge. He slammed the magnetic wrench onto the floor and activated its high-output pulse. The wrench was a Terrasol mining tool designed to pull iron ore out of asteroid crusts. At full power, it created a localized magnetic field strong enough to stop a small shuttle. The sledge guard's internal gyroscope screamed. Its matte black armor, a ferrocarbon composite, was suddenly seized by an invisible force. The machine didn't just stop, it was jerked violently toward the wrench, its hydraulic lines snapping under the sudden, unnatural tension. Cryosian blue hydraulic fluid sprayed across the sand like neon blood. The machine collapsed, its limbs twitching in a pathetic, rhythmic dance. Cyprian stood over it, leaning heavily on his wrench, his face pale and covered in grime. "The machine is broken," he gasped, looking up at Volt. "Want me to fix it, or should we move on to the next vow?" The silence in the stadium was absolute. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Archon Xylia stood in the royal box, her sapphire face illuminated by a strange, sharp light. She wasn't just clapping, she was looking at Cyprian as if he had just rewritten the laws of physics. "The second vow is complete," she announced, her voice echoing through the stunned arena. "The human has endured." Cyprian didn't wait for the cheers or the jeers. He turned and walked out of the pit, every step a symphony of pain. As he passed through the tunnel, Reen met him, his eyes wide. "You've done it, Grounder. You've officially made every warrior in this city feel like a complete idiot. Volt is going to have a stroke." "Good," Cyprian wheezed, collapsing into Reen's arms. Tell him I'll send a bill for the wrench." But as he lost consciousness again, he knew the victory was hollow. He had won the battle of the body, but the real war, the war for the soul of the hegemony, was only just beginning. And the next vow, the vow of the mind, would require him to see something much more terrifying than a combat droid. He would have to see the truth. The ancestral loom was not a computer. It was a cathedral of light and sorrow, buried deep beneath the permafrost of Krios Prime. Here the temperature was kept at a constant -40 degrees to prevent the quantum processors from destabilizing. Thousands of crystalline pillars rose from the floor, each one glowing with the flickering amber light of 1,000 stored memories. This was the heart of the hegemony, a collective consciousness of every Cryosian hero who had ever died in battle. Cyprian Voss stood at the entrance, shivering in a thick, fur-lined parka provided by Reen. Beside him, Xylia looked perfectly at home in the freezing dark, her blue skin taking on a luminescent quality. "This is where you will face the vow of the mind," she said. Her voice was hushed, respectful. "You will interface with the loom. It will present you with a strategic crisis from our history. You must find a solution that the original commanders missed. If you fail, the loom will reject your neural pattern. And by reject, you mean liquefy my brain, right?" Cyprian asked, his breath misting in the air. "It is a possibility," Xylia admitted, "but the loom is fair. It values logic above all else." "Logic," Cyprian muttered. "Right. My favorite thing." He walked to the central dais, where a crown of silver needles waited. This was the neural interface, the bridge between his human mind and the vast alien ocean of the loom. He took a deep breath, thinking of the 400 people on the Vengeance, of the billions of people on Earth who had no idea their fate rested on a guy who still couldn't remember his own Netflix password. He sat down and allowed the needles to settle against his temples. The world didn't dissolve this time. It shattered. Cyprian found himself standing on a bridge of a ship, but it wasn't the Vengeance. It was ancient, a clunky, steam-belching dreadnought from the early days of the hegemony's expansion. Outside the viewscreen, a lush green planet was being bombarded by orbital strikes. Thousands of ships, primitive but numerous, were swarming the Cryosian fleet. "This is the Battle of the Verdant Reach," a voice echoed in his head. It was the loom, not a single voice, but a chorus of millions. The hegemony faced the Sylvari hive. We were outnumbered 10-1. Our tactical models predicted total annihilation. The commander chose to ignite the planet's atmosphere, killing the hive and the fleet, but saving the hegemony from invasion. "Find a better way." Cyprian looked at the tactical displays. The Silvery hive wasn't attacking with strategy. They were attacking with hunger. They were a biological swarm drawn to the high-energy output of the Cryosian reactors. He began to manipulate the holographic controls, his fingers moving with a grace born of 1,000 hours of system diagnostics. He didn't look at the ships as enemies. He looked at them as components in a biological circuit. "If I fluctuate the reactor frequencies," he thought, "I can create a harmonic resonance that mimics the Sylvari's own communication signals." He worked frantically, his human mind straining to process the sheer volume of data the loom was pouring into him. He saw the lives of the soldiers on the dreadnought, their fear, their pride, their desperate desire to go home. He felt their memories pressing against his own, a crushing weight of history. But as he dug deeper into the loom's architecture, he found something else, something hidden beneath the layers of tactical data and hero worship. It was a pocket of raw, unrefined agony. He diverted a portion of his consciousness, following the trail of distorted code. He found himself in a dark corner of the simulation, a place where the light of the pillars didn't reach. There he saw them, not the heroes, not the commanders, the scrap-born. Ashranan, they were the neural patterns of the Cryosian dissidents, the criminals, the weak, and the failed children. They weren't stored in amber pillars. They were being used as raw processing power, their suffering harvested to maintain the loom's massive computational needs. They were the ghosts in the carbon, a foundation of pain upon which the entire hegemony was built. Cyprian's heart stopped. He saw a child's face flicker in the code, a girl no older than 10, her neural pattern being stretched and shredded to calculate the trajectory of a plasma bolt. "This isn't a cathedral," Cyprian whispered, his voice cracking even in the simulation. "This is a slaughterhouse." The loom roared. The chorus of voices turned into a screech of static. "You are here to solve the crisis, human. Do not look into the foundations. I can't solve the crisis if the system itself is the problem," Cyprian screamed back. He abandoned the tactical simulation, his mind diving deeper into the dark code. He used his engineer's intuition to find the master-slave protocols that bound the scrapborn to the loom. He began to snip the connections. One by one, he released the tortured souls, rerouting the loom's energy to compensate for the loss of processing power. It was like performing surgery on a lightning bolt. Back in the physical world, the crystalline pillars began to vibrate. A low, ominous hum filled the chamber. Xylia stepped forward, her eyes wide with terror. "Cyprian, stop! You're destabilizing the core." High Prefect Volt appeared at the entrance, flanked by a dozen guards. He was smiling. "The human has failed," he announced. "He is a virus. Purge the interface." "No!" Xylia shouted, drawing her blade. "He is still inside." In the simulation, Cyprian reached the central node. The girl's face was clear now. She was looking at him with eyes that were no longer voids, but filled with a soft amber light. "Thank you," she whispered. Cyprian felt a wave of peace wash over him, followed by a jolt of pure, unadulterated power. He didn't just solve the battle of the Verdant Reach, he rewrote it. He showed the loom how to use the harmonic resonance to draw the silvery hive away from the planet and toward a nearby gas giant, saving both the hegemony fleet and the innocent life on the surface. He showed the loom that strength didn't have to come from sacrifice. It could come from connection. The world shattered again. Cyprian fell forward off the dais, the silver needles clattering to the floor. He coughed, spitting out a mouthful of blood, his body trembling so hard he couldn't stand. Xylia was there in an instant, her arms around him, her cold skin a welcome anchor in the spinning world. Did I win?" he wheezed. The loom was silent. The amber light in the pillars had changed. It was no longer flickering, but steady, glowing with a warmth that had never been seen in the Citadel. The eldest elder, a woman whose skin was as translucent as glass, stepped forward from the shadows. She looked at the monitors, then at Cyprian. "The vow of the mind is complete," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "The human has not only found a superior solution, he has healed the ancestors." Volt stepped forward, his face a mask of rage. "This is heresy. He interfered with the sacred data. He must be executed." The elder turned to him, her gaze as cold as the permafrost. "The loom has accepted him, High Prefect. To touch him now would be to strike at the heart of the hegemony itself. He is no longer an outsider. He is a soul light." Volt looked at Cyprian, his eyes burning with a hatred that promised 1,000 deaths. "This isn't over, human. You may have fooled the dead, but the living still have teeth." He turned and strode out of the chamber, his guards following like a dark tide. Xylia helped Cyprian to his feet. Her hand stayed on his arm, her thumb brushing against his orange coveralls. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked, her voice so low only he could hear. "The ones in the dark." "I saw them," Cyprian said, his voice raw. "Xylia, your whole world. It's built on a lie. You think you are strong because you are cruel, but that cruelty is eating you from the inside out." Xylia looked at the glowing pillars. "I have known," she admitted. "I have felt the sorrow in the echoes since I was a child, but I thought it was the price of survival." "It doesn't have to be," Cyprian said. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the person behind the Archon. He saw the girl who had been raised in a freezer, told that her only value was in how many people she could kill. He saw the loneliness that mirrored his own. And then, in the middle of the coldest place in the galaxy, Cyprian Voss did the most dangerous thing yet. He didn't hug her. He didn't sabotage a weapon. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of silver hair behind her ear. "You are more than a blade, Xylia." Xylia didn't pull away. She didn't strike him. She just stood there, her starlight pupils wide, as the warmth of his hand seeped into her skin. "I think," she whispered, "I am beginning to believe you." But as they left the Citadel, the sky above Krios Prime was darkening. The obsidian dirge was moving into position, its massive silhouette blocking out the stars. Volt had lost the battle of the body and the battle of the mind, but he still held the ultimate weapon, and he was not a man who believed in second chances. Cyprian looked up at the black ship, his heart heavy. He had 2 more days before the final vow, the vow of the spirit, and he had a feeling that the truth he had found in the loom was only the tip of the iceberg. The real darkness was yet to come. "Wait," Cyprian said to Reen as they walked back to the transport. "You said Volt has ice bloods in the lower sectors. What exactly does that mean?" "It's street slang," Reen grunted, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It refers to the workers who spend their lives in the coolant tunnels. They are the lowest caste, the ones the hegemony forgot. They use a dialect called frost grit. They are the ones who hear the echoes most clearly. And right now, thanks to you, they are starting to talk." "Talk about what?" About the fact that a soft skin from a backwater planet just did what no creation has done in 1,000 years. They are talking about hope, Cyprian, and in the hegemony, hope is a capital offense. Cyprian sighed, his ribs aching with every step. Great. I went from being a repairman to a revolutionary. I really need to stop being so helpful. But as he looked at Xylia, walking tall and silent beside him, he knew he couldn't stop. Not now, because the system was broken, and he was the only one who knew where the leaks were. He just hoped he could fix it before the whole galaxy went down the drain. He leaned toward Xylia as they boarded the sledge. Hey, Archon, one more thing. She looked at him. Yes? If we survive this, you are definitely buying me a real drink, and none of that blue electric stuff. I want something that doesn't try to fight back when I swallow it. Xylia's lips twitched, a movement so small it was almost invisible, but to Cyprian, it was louder than a supernova. I will consider it, human. It was the best, solid copy he'd heard all day. As the void sledge lifted off, the amber light of the ancestral loom faded into the distance. But the warmth in Cyprian's chest remained. He had planted a seed of empathy in the coldest soil in the universe. Now he just had to make sure he lived long enough to see it bloom. The obsidian dirge loomed above, a silent predator in the night. The countdown to the final vow had begun, and the lines between right and wrong were blurring faster than a quantum fold engine. Cyprian Voss, the accidental diplomat, was no longer just buying time. He was fighting for a future that neither side thought was possible, and he was doing it one broken system at a time. The private sanctuary of the Archon was a place where the crushing weight of Cryosian history finally felt thin enough to breathe. It was a suspended garden of crystalline flora located in the highest spire of the Citadel, far above the reach of the freezing winds that scoured the surface of Cryos Prime. Here the plants did not grow from soil, but from refined mineral lattices, their leaves glowing with a soft, bioluminescent lavender that mirrored the twilight of the system's triple suns. Cyprian Voss sat on a low stone bench, his orange coveralls a jarring contrast to the elegant, alien beauty around him. His ribs were still screaming in protest every time he took a deep breath, but the silence of the garden was a better sedative than any medical gel. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at a small translucent flower that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. It is called a resonator bloom, Xylia said, her voice appearing from the shadows of a nearby archway. It reacts to the neural frequencies of those in its proximity. It seems to find yours agitated. Cyprian didn't look up. Agitated is my default setting, Xylia. You would be too if you spent 48 hours being treated like a lab rat in a freezer. Xylia stepped into the light. She had discarded her formal tunic for a simpler wrap of dark silk, revealing the full extent of the silver ritual tattoos that traced the lines of her collarbones. Without her armor, she looked less like a weapon of war and more like a woman carrying the weight of 1,000 worlds on her shoulders. I have brought something, she said, holding out a small obsidian flask. You requested a beverage that does not fight back. This is an infusion of sun grains from the southern valleys. It is used by our scholars to quiet the mind. Cyprian took the flask, his fingers brushing against hers. He felt the familiar spark of static, but this time he didn't pull away. He unscrewed the cap and took a cautious sip. It was warm, tasting of honey, toasted nuts, and a hint of something sharp like cinnamon. Wow, he whispered, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. That is actually amazing. No sparks? No sudden urge to invade a neighboring system? Xylia sat beside him, leaving exactly 6 inches of space between them. We are not without culture, Cyprian, though my father would have you believe that anything that does not sharpen the sword is a waste of resources. Cyprian took another drink, savoring the heat. Your father is a real piece of work. He looks at a garden like this and probably just sees a failure in defensive planning. Too many hiding spots, right? Xylia let out a breath that was almost a sigh. He sees a vulnerability. He believes that anything that provides comfort makes the warrior soft. He has spent 30 years stripping the hegemony of its softness, one law at a time. He calls it the Great Hardening. Cyprian turned to look at her, his hazel eyes crinkling with a mixture of pity and frustration. And you? What do you see when you look at this garden? I see a ghost, she whispered, her starlight pupils fixed on the resonator bloom. This garden was planted by my mother, before she was lost in the expansion of the outer rim. She was a speaker for the loom, a role that required the highest levels of empathy. She used to say that the hegemony was a body that had forgotten how to feel, and that one day the numbness would kill us. She sounds like she was a smart woman, Cyprian said. She was executed for treason, Xylia countered, her voice turning cold. My father was the one who signed the warrant. He said her emotional instability was a threat to the stability of the bloodline. He adopted me afterward to ensure her gifts were properly channeled into military strategy. Cyprian felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. Jesus, Xylia, that is foobar. Seriously, he killed your mother and then turned you into a general? And you still serve him? Xylia turned to him, her expression a mask of rigid duty. I serve the hegemony, Cyprian. My father is the state, and the state is our survival. What choice is there? To rebel is to invite the void. We are surrounded by empires that would tear us apart the moment we showed a crack in our resolve. That is the lie they always tell you, isn't it? Cyprian asked, his voice low and intense. That the world is a dark, scary place, and only the big, bad military can keep you safe. But look at the coalition. Look at Earth. We aren't warriors, but we're still here. We survived the Great Warming, the resource wars, and 3 close calls with extinction, not by being the toughest, but by being the most connected. We realize that if you help your neighbor fix their life support, they're less likely to point a railgun at yours. Your people are an anomaly, Xylia said, a statistical impossibility. Maybe, Cyprian admitted, but we're a happy one. He leaned back, looking up at the vaulted glass ceiling. You asked me why I became a repairman. The truth is, I was a soldier once, or something like it. I was part of a PSYOP unit, a specialized team trained to dismantle the enemy without firing a single shot. We studied the psychology of conflict, the way fear is used to manufacture consent for war. I was good at it. Too good. What happened? Xylia asked, her curiosity overriding her reserve. I realized that my bosses weren't interested in dismantling the enemy's fear, Cyprian said. They wanted to weaponize it. They wanted me to find the cracks in a culture so they could drive a wedge into them. I was sent to a colony that was starting to talk about independence. My job was to stabilize the situation. I spent 6 months there, talking to the people, hearing about their lives, their kids, their hopes for a future that wasn't dictated by a board of directors 3 light years away. He paused, his grip tightening on the flask. I couldn't do it. I couldn't break them. So I leaked the military's tactical plans to the colony's leaders and told my superiors the situation was a snafu. They figured it out, of course. I was court-martialed, stripped of my rank, and buried in the sanitation department. They thought it was a punishment, spending my life fixing toilets and air filters. But I loved it. Machines don't have agendas. They don't lie. If a pump is broken, you fix it, and the water flows. It's honest work. Xylia was watching him with an intensity that made his skin tingle. You chose a lesser life to preserve your soul, she said. It was an observation, not a question. I chose to stop being a wedge, Cyprian corrected. I wanted to be the glue. They sat in silence for a long time, the resonator bloom between them turning a deep, peaceful violet. For the first time, the 6 inches of space between them felt like a bridge rather than a barrier. Xylia reached out, her hand hesitating before finally resting on top of Cyprian's. Her skin was cool, but there was a thrum of energy beneath it that felt like a low-voltage circuit. The 3rd vow, she whispered, the vow of the spirit. It is tomorrow. My father has moved the ceremony to the bridge of the obsidian dirge. The warship? Cyprian asked, his heart beginning to race. Why there? Because the dirge is more than a ship, Xylia said, her eyes dark with concern. It is the pinnacle of our military achievement. It is where the ancestral loom is most integrated with our weapon systems. Volt wants you to face the spirit of the hegemony in the very heart of its power. He believes that the sheer weight of our collective will crush your soft human psyche. Then let him try, Cyprian said, though his voice lacked conviction. I've survived his arena and his slaughterhouse computer. I'm starting to think I'm just too stubborn to break. Xylia squeezed his hand. Do not be arrogant, Cyprian. The dirge is different. The echoes there are not of scholars or gardeners. They are the echoes of the destroyers, the souls of those who burn worlds to keep our borders secure. Their hunger for conflict is a physical force. I've dealt with angry ghosts before, Cyprian said, trying to regain his sarcastic edge. Just give me a screwdriver and a can of WD-40, and I'll have them singing show tunes by midnight. Xylia didn't laugh. Her starlight pupils were fixed on his face searchingly. If you fail, Cyprian, if the spirit rejects you, I will be ordered to execute the failed mate personally. It is the law. Cyprian looked at her, his expression softening. And will you? I have never disobeyed an order, Xylia said, her voice trembling. Never. Not in 10,000 days of service. There is a first time for everything, Archon, Cyprian said. Before she could respond, a shrill, piercing alarm cut through the peace of the garden. The resonator bloom instantly turned a jagged, angry red. The garden's entrance hissed open, and Reen burst inside, his face pale and his armor scuffed. Archon, you must come to the command center immediately. What is it? Xylia asked, standing up and instantly regressing back into her warrior persona. A Terrasol scout ship, Reen gasped, his chest heaving. It just decloaked inside our inner defensive perimeter. It fired a high-yield fusion torpedo at the Dyson ring. Cyprian stood up, his mind reeling. What? That is impossible. The Coalition doesn't even have cloaking tech that can bypass your sensors. And we wouldn't attack the ring. It's a civilian power source. The feed is live on the tactical net, Reen said, his eyes darting to Cyprian with a look of suspicion. It's a Ranger-class vessel, tail number TS-77. Cyprian felt the blood drain from his face. That is my old unit's designation, but that ship was decommissioned 2 years ago. Volt is already moving the fleet to intercept, Reen said. He has declared the peace accord null and void. He is calling for the immediate execution of the Earth delegation as spies and saboteurs. Xylia turned to Cyprian, her face a mask of stone. Was this your plan, human? Was the glue just a cover for the wedge? Xylia, no! Cyprian shouted, reaching for her. This is a setup. It has to be. Volt is manufacturing a pretext. Xylia didn't flinch, but the starlight in her eyes was cold and distant. I must go to the command center. Reen, secure the human. If he resists, use lethal force. Xylia, listen to me, Cyprian cried as she strode toward the door. Check the engine signatures. If it's a setup, the ion trail won't match a standard Terrasol reactor. Just look at the data. She didn't look back. The door hissed shut, leaving Cyprian alone in the garden with Reen and the resonator bloom, which was now pulsing with a rhythmic, terrifying black. This isn't good, ground pounder, Reen said, his hand hovering over his sidearm. Not good at all. Tell me about it, Cyprian muttered, his mind already racing through the systems of the obsidian dirge, looking for the one leak that could drown 2 worlds. The turning point had arrived, and it was wrapped in a lie. The command center of the Citadel was a cavernous dome of shifting holographic light. It looked less like a room and more like the inside of a shattered diamond, with tactical displays, sensor feeds, and communication streams refracting across every surface. At the center of it all stood High Prefect Volt, his indigo skin bathed in the ominous red glow of a Level 1 alert. He looked every inch the conqueror, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the replay of the attack. On the main tactical display, a small, sleek vessel with the distinctive blocky silhouette of a Terrasol Ranger was weaving through the Cryosian defensive satellites. A streak of violet energy erupted from its hull, slamming into the shimmering lattice of the Dyson ring. The impact was spectacular, a blossoming flower of blue-white fire that sent tremors through the local gravity field. Behold the peace of the humans, Volt announced, his voice booming through the chamber as Xylia entered. Deception, sabotage, cowardice. They talk of harmony while they strike at our heart. Xylia marched to the central console, her eyes scanning the raw sensor data with the speed of a combat computer. Report, she commanded. The vessel decloaked 3 minutes ago at the 004 vector. a tactical officer reported, his fingers flying across his interface. It bypassed our long-range arrays by mimicking the gravitational signature of a wandering comet. It fired a single high-yield warhead before retreating toward the jump gate. And the Earth delegation? Xylia asked, her voice tight. Confined to their quarters under heavy guard, Volt said, turning to face his daughter. They claim ignorance, of course. Ambassador Miller is currently weeping into his synthetic tea, insisting it must be a misunderstanding. Xylia didn't look at him. She was staring at the ion trail of the attacking ship. The blue line of the exhaust was flickering, showing a subtle oscillation in the 1,000 hertz range. This reactor signature, she muttered. It is inconsistent. A Terrasol Ranger uses a twin-core fusion drive. It should produce a steady, linear decay. This is stuttering. It is a damaged ship, Volt dismissed with a wave of his hand. Likely a suicide mission. The human Voss probably gave them the codes to bypass our inner ring while he was fixing the echo drive. Cyprian Voss does not have access to our defensive codes, Xylia said, her voice rising. He is an engineer, not a cryptographer. He is a specialist in psychological manipulation, Volt roared, stepping closer to her, his shadow looming over her. He manipulated you, Xylia. He found the softness your mother left in you, and he used it to blind you to the threat. He played the part of the bumbling repairman while his comrades moved into position to cripple our power source. Xylia flinched as if struck. The accusation was a jagged blade cutting through her growing trust in Cyprian. She looked back at the display, her mind racing. The logic of the hegemony was simple. Earth was a threat, the attack was real, and the human was the catalyst. To believe otherwise was to invite the suspicion of the state. But she remembered the warmth of Cyprian's hand in the garden. She remembered the resonator bloom turning violet. High Prefect, Xylia said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If the coalition wanted to attack the ring, they would not send a single decommissioned scout ship. They would send a carrier group. This is inefficient. It is a probe, Volt countered. A test of our resolve, and we shall answer it with the full weight of the obsidian dirge. He turned back to the tactical officer. Prepare the dirge for immediate jump. We will trace the scout ship back to its point of origin. If it is a Terrasol base, we will raise it to the bedrock. And what of the human? Xylia asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Volt smiled, a cold predatory expression. The third vow will proceed as scheduled, on the bridge of the dirge, but the parameters have changed. It is no longer a test of his worthiness to be your mate. It is a trial for high treason. He leaned in close to Xylia, his breath smelling of bitter sun grains. And you, Archon, will be the judge. If the spirit of the loom finds him guilty, and it will, you will execute him before the fleet as a sign of your renewed loyalty to the hegemony. If you refuse, I will declare you a co-conspirator and have you both vaporized. Volt turned and strode out of the command center, his laughter echoing in the hollow space of the dome. Xylia stood alone at the console, the red light of the alert reflecting in her starlight eyes. She looked down at the sensor feed again, focusing on the stuttering ion trail. She was a master of strategy, a student of the loom. She knew when a system was being forced. This is a wedge, she whispered to herself. Back in the garden sanctuary, the atmosphere was thick with the tension of a 0-hour countdown. Cyprian Voss was no longer sitting on the bench. He was pacing a tight circle, his hands moving in the air as if he were manipulating an invisible holographic interface. Reen stood by the door, his gravity lance held at a 45-degree angle. He was watching Cyprian with a look of profound unease. Ground pounder, sit down. You're making the floor nervous. Reen, listen to me, Cyprian said, stopping in front of him. I need you to get a message to Ambassador Miller. Tell him to check the long-range comm logs for a ghost signal on the subspace band. If my old unit is being framed, someone had to trigger that cloaking device remotely. I can't do that, Reen said, his voice flat. I'm under orders. No communication. Reen, the High Prefect is about to start a war based on a lie, Cyprian shouted, his eyes wide with desperation. You saw what I did in the pit. You saw what I did in the loom. I am not a saboteur. I'm the guy who found the scream in your ship's engine. Do you really think I'd try to blow up the thing that keeps you alive? Reen looked away, his jaw clenched. It doesn't matter what I think. I am a shield sworn. I follow the Archon. And where is she? Cyprian asked. She's in the command center, surrounded by people telling her that the guy she was starting to trust is a monster. She needs a counter signal, Reen. She needs the truth. The door hissed open, but it wasn't Xylia. It was a squad of Volt's personal guard, their black armor polished to a mirror finish. They didn't say a word. They simply surrounded Cyprian, their lances humming with kinetic charge. The High Prefect has requested the prisoner's presence on the Obsidian Dirge, the leader announced. Reen stepped forward, his own lance lowering. The Archon gave me custody of the human. The High Prefect has overridden the Archon's authority in matters of high treason, the guard replied, his voice a mechanical drone. Stand aside, Shield Sworn, or be declared a traitor. Reen looked at Cyprian, then at the guards. For a long, agonizing moment, the balance of the galaxy hung in the air. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, Reen stepped aside. I'm sorry, Grounder, he whispered. Cyprian felt the cold bite of the magnetic cuffs as they snapped around his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just looked at the resonator bloom one last time. It was now a solid, unchanging black, the color of a dying star. I've had a lot of bad days, Cyprian thought as they marched him toward the hangar. But this one is definitely in the top 5. The transport flight to the Obsidian Dirge was a blur of silence and shadow. The Dirge was a leviathan of the void, a 3-kilometer spike of black metal that seemed to drink the light of the stars. As they docked, Cyprian felt the shift in gravity. It was heavier here, more oppressive. The ship itself felt alive, but not in the way the Vengeance had. This was a cold mechanical hunger, the echoes of 1,000 wars resonating through the hull. They led him to the bridge, a vast cathedral of war that dwarfed the Citadel's command center. The floor was made of reinforced glass, looking down into the massive glowing core of the ancestral loom's primary tactical node. Thousands of Cryosian officers stood at their stations, their faces illuminated by the violet glow of the weapon-charging arrays. At the far end of the bridge, Xylia stood on a raised platform, her full combat armor back in place. Her face was hidden behind a silver war mask, but her eyes, those voids of starlight, were fixed on Cyprian. Beside her, Volt stood like a dark god, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The trial begins, Volt announced, his voice carrying through the bridge. Cyprian Voss, you are accused of high treason against the hegemony. You are accused of using your position as a mate to sabotage our defenses and coordinate an attack on our Dyson ring. How do you plead? I plead for someone to find a brain in this room, Cyprian shouted, his voice echoing in the vast space. This is a setup, Volt. You manufactured that attack. You used a decommissioned ship and a remote trigger cloak. Lies from a dying tongue, Volt dismissed. He turned to the bridge crew. Connect the human to the spirit of the dirge. Let the ancestors judge his soul. 2 guards forced Cyprian into a central chair, the same silver needles from the loom descending from the ceiling. He looked up at Xylia, his eyes pleading. Xylia, please, look at the data. Don't let him do this. Xylia didn't move. Her voice filtered through the war mask was cold and metallic. The vow of the spirit is the ultimate truth, human. If you are innocent, the spirit will protect you. If you are guilty, it will consume you. The needles touched his temples. The world vanished. Cyprian wasn't in a cathedral this time. He was in a storm, a raging, howling vortex of black shadows and red light. He felt the weight of 1,000 genocides pressing down on him. He saw cities burning, stars dying, and a sea of blue-skinned warriors screaming for blood. This was the collective consciousness of the destroyers, the parts of the Cryosian history that they tried to hide from the world. The rage, the hate, the sheer, unadulterated need to dominate. You are soft, the voices hissed, a million razors cutting through his mind. You are a glitch. We will delete you. Cyprian didn't try to fix the storm. He couldn't. This wasn't a broken system. It was a perfect one. It was exactly what it was meant to be, a machine of pure hatred. He felt his own mind starting to fray, His memories of Earth, of his mother, of the garden. They were being eroded by the black tide. He felt the urge to scream, to give in, to let the hatred take him. But then he remembered the resonator bloom. He remembered the violet light. He stopped fighting. He stopped trying to be an engineer. He went back to being a psyop. He didn't look for the cracks. He looked for the person behind the storm. Somewhere in the middle of all that rage, there had to be a beginning. A point where the first warrior decided that fear was better than love. He dove deeper, ignoring the pain that felt like hot lead in his brain. He found the core of the spirit. It wasn't a single person, it was a choice. A collective agreement to be numb so they wouldn't have to feel the horror of what they were doing. "I see you," Cyprian whispered in the dark. "I see the fear you are hiding. You aren't strong. You're just terrified of being forgotten." The storm faltered. The voices grew quiet. Back on the bridge, the officers watched in horror as the main tactical display began to flicker. The Obsidian Dirge's weapon systems, which had been locked on Earth coordinates, suddenly began to recycle. "What is happening?" Volt demanded, slamming his fist onto the console. "Override the AI. The AI is not responding, Prefect," the officer cried. It is listening to the human." Xylia stepped forward, her hand moving to her war mask. She tore it off, revealing a face wet with tears. "He isn't breaking," she whispered. He's forgiving them." In the simulation, Cyprian reached out and touched the center of the storm. He didn't use force. He used the tactile surrender. He gave the spirit of the hegemony the same hug he had given Xylia. The storm didn't vanish. It turned into a garden of resonator blooms, all of them a brilliant, blinding violet. "We remember," the voices whispered, no longer screaming, but weeping. "We remember the softness." Cyprian opened his eyes. He was back on the bridge of the dirge. The silver needles retracted, and he fell forward, his body spent. Xylia was there. She caught him before he hit the glass floor, her arms wrapping around him in a genuine, desperate embrace. "Cyprian," she whispered, "I saw it. I felt the spirit change." Volt let out a primal scream of rage. He drew his sword, the blade glowing with a lethal violet light. "Enough! If the dead will not do their duty, then the living will." He lunged toward them, but he was stopped by a wall of obsidian plate. Reen and a dozen royal guards stood between the High Prefect and the Archon. Their lances were leveled at Volt's chest. "Stand down, Prefect," Reen said, his voice a low rumble. "The spirit has spoken. The human is innocent. To strike him now is to strike at the ancestors." "Get out of my way," Volt roared. "I am your commander." "Not anymore," Xylia said, standing up. She looked at her father, her starlight eyes no longer cold, but burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "You manufactured the attack, Father. I found the stutter in the ion trail. It was a cryosian engine core, tuned to mimic a terrasol frequency. You didn't do it to protect the hegemony. You did it to protect your power." She turned to the bridge crew. "High Prefect Volt is relieved of command. Secure him for trial by the Council of Elders." The officers hesitated for a heartbeat, looking from Volt to Xylia. Then as one, they saluted the Archon. The wedge had been removed. The glue was holding. But as they led Volt away, the High Prefect turned back to look at Cyprian. "You think you've won, human? You think empathy can stop a war that has been 10,000 years in the making? My agents are already on Earth. The clock is still ticking." He laughed as the doors hissed shut behind him. Cyprian leaned against Xylia, his breath coming in shallow gasps. We have to stop them, Xylia. The agents, they're going to trigger the Dirge's weapon remotely from the Earth side." "How?" Xylia asked, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're going to use a ghost signal," Cyprian said. "The same one they used to cloak the scout ship. If we don't shut down the Dirge's receivers in the next 10 minutes, Earth is gone." Xylia looked at the tactical display. The weapon was still charging, 90% capacity. "I can't shut it down from here," she said. "The command codes are locked to Volt's neural pattern." "Then I'll do it," Cyprian said, pushing himself away from her. "I'll go into the core. I'll fix the system from the inside." "Cyprian, the core is shielded," Xylia cried. "The radiation will kill you in minutes." I'm a repairman, Xylia, Cyprian said, a tired smile playing on his lips. I've survived worse hangovers than a little bit of radiation. He looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see an archon or an alien. He saw a friend, a partner, a reason to keep the world from breaking. Give me 5 minutes, he said, and then we go get that drink. Xylia didn't say a word. She just leaned in and pressed her forehead against his, the Cryosian gesture of the eternal bond. Go, she whispered. Fix it. Cyprian turned and ran toward the elevator, his orange coveralls disappearing into the black shadows of the warship. The turning point was over. Now it was time for the finish. The descent into the bowels of the obsidian dirge was a journey into the mouth of a mechanical god. Cyprian Voss stood inside a gravity lift that plummeted through the central spine of the 3-kilometer warship, the air growing thick with the scent of ionizing radiation and scorched copper. The walls of the lift were transparent, revealing the dizzying complexity of the vessel's internals. Thousands of miles of conduit pulsing with violet energy, vast hangars filled with dormant interceptors, and the massive cathedral-like spaces where the neural lattice of the ancestral loom intertwined with the ship's primary structural supports. His radiation sensor, a small device clipped to the collar of his orange coveralls, began to emit a low, persistent whine. The display shifted from a safe green to an ominous amber. He was entering the hot zone. You're really doing this, aren't you, Grounder? Reen's voice crackled over the internal comlink. The signal was degraded, filled with the static of the dirge's immense electromagnetic field. Cyprian leaned his head against the cold glass, his vision beginning to swim with the first signs of neural fatigue. I've always been a sucker for a broken system, Reen, and this one is the mother of all cluster pays. If I don't pull the plug on this ghost signal, Earth is going to have a very short, very bright afternoon. The Archon is clearing the lower decks of Volt's loyalists, Reen reported. It's a total snafu up here. The High Prefect's goons are playing hide-and-seek in the ventilation shafts. But Xylia, she's a force of nature. She's fighting like she's trying to purge the last 10,000 years of history with a single blade. Tell her to save some for me, Cyprian joked, though his voice sounded thin. The lift slammed to a halt at the lowest level of the ship. The doors groaned open, revealing a chamber that defied human comprehension. This was the heart of the dirge. At the center of a mile-wide sphere stood a captured singularity, a microscopic black hole suspended within a web of graviton emitters. This was the ship's power source, and its primary weapon. Around the singularity, millions of crystalline shards floated in a slow, hypnotic orbit. The physical storage units for the destroyers. The most violent souls in the Cryosian archives. The temperature here was a blistering 50 degrees Celsius, the heat radiating off the graviton emitters in shimmering waves. Cyprian stepped out of the lift, his boots clanking on the metal catwalk that stretched out over the abyss. The radiation sensor in his collar turned red and began to shriek. Shut up, he whispered to the device, ripping it off and tossing it into the dark. I know. He began to run toward the central control terminal, a spire of black obsidian that rose from the base of the sphere. His skin felt like it was being pricked by 1,000 needles, a symptom of the high-energy particles tearing through his cells. His brain felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The vow of the spirit had opened his mind, but it had also left him vulnerable to the psychic static of the ship. Died, soft, creature. The voices were back, not a storm this time, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of malice. The shards orbiting the singularity began to glow with an angry, jagged light. They knew he was here. The ghosts in the carbon were hungry for a target. Cyprian reached the terminal and slammed his hands onto the interface. The obsidian surface was hot enough to blister his palms, but he didn't pull away. He needed to find the receiver for the subspace band. He needed to find the ghost signal. Interface engaged, a voice whispered in his mind. It was Admiral Scar, the spirit he had calmed on the Vengeance. Scar's presence was weak here, drowned out by the roar of the destroyers, but he was holding on. The path is blocked. Human Volt has encrypted the logic gates with a bloodlock. Then we'll have to bypass the logic, Cyprian thought. his fingers flying across the holographic arrays. I'm an engineer, Scar. I don't follow the rules. I exploit the exceptions. He began to reroute the power from the secondary life support systems of the bridge into the terminal. He was starving the ship of air to feed his search. He saw the data streams, millions of lines of Cryosian battle code, beautiful and terrifying in their complexity. He searched for the stutter, the tiny recurring frequency that marked a remote trigger signal, and then he found it. It wasn't a Cryosian signal, it was human. Cyprian froze. The waveform was unmistakable. It was a triple burst encryption, the kind used by the Aegis Group, a hardline isolationist faction within Earth's own military. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Volt hadn't just manufactured an attack, he had found a partner on the other side. The signal was coming from a hidden transmitter on Earth's moon. It wasn't just a trigger for the weapon, it was a set of coordinates. The Aegis Group didn't want to stop the war. They wanted to start it. They wanted the Cryosians to strike Earth so they could seize emergency power and purify humanity with a retaliatory strike using stolen Cryosian tech. It's a mirror, Cyprian whispered, his eyes stinging with sweat and tears. Two worlds, two systems, both broken by the same fear. Destroy them. The voices of the shards roared, their light turning a blinding violet. The traitors must burn. Cyprian looked up at the orbiting shards. He saw the faces of the warriors who had built this weapon. They weren't just monsters. They were people who had been told that their only choice was to kill or be killed. They were trapped in a cycle of violence that had lasted for 30 centuries. "You're wrong," he shouted at the abyss. "It's not about traitors. It's about the wedge. Someone is driving a wedge between us because they're afraid of what happens when we stand together." He dove back into the terminal, his hands moving with a desperate, frantic energy. He didn't try to block the signal. He couldn't. It was already too late. The Dirge's weapon arrays were at 95% capacity. In 5 minutes, the singularity would be forced into a state of hyper-excitation, releasing a burst of graviton energy that would tear the crust off Earth's western hemisphere. Instead, he began to modify the weapon's output. He went into the core logic of the singularity chamber, the part of the system that governed how the energy was focused. "What are you doing?" Scar's voice asked, flickering with alarm. "You will burn out your mind." "I'm changing the interface," Cyprian thought. "This ship, it's not just a gun, Scar. It's a bridge. The neural lattice connects millions of minds. If I can shift the excitation frequency from gravitons to neural bursts, you will broadcast yourself to the entire fleet and to Earth," Cyprian added. "I'm going to show them the truth. Not just the data, the feeling, the fear, the hope. I'm going to give everyone a front row seat to what it feels like to almost lose everything." He began to weave his own neural patterns into the weapon's firing sequence. It was a suicide mission. The human brain was never meant to handle the throughput of a singularity-driven transmitter. He could feel his synapses beginning to pop, small bursts of white light in his vision that signaled permanent neural damage. His skin was turning a pale, sickly gray under the violet light. His nose began to bleed, the red droplets evaporating before they could hit the hot terminal. "Just a little more," he wheezed. "Just a few more. Gates." Suddenly, a heavy hand slammed onto his shoulder. Cyprian was jerked away from the terminal, his head snapping back as he hit the metal catwalk. General Volt stood over him, his armor scorched and his face a mask of primal fury. He had escaped his guards. He looked like a demon of the void, his indigo skin darkened by soot and blood. "You will not ruin this, human," Volt hissed, his blade glowing with a lethal edge. "You will not steal our destiny with your pathetic sentiments." Cyprian looked up at him, a bloody smile on his lips. "Your destiny is a graveyard, Volt. I'm just trying to change the reservation." Volt raised his blade. "I should have killed you in the pit. I should have turned you into scrap the moment you touched my daughter." "Then why didn't you?" Cyprian asked, his voice a rasping whisper. "Because deep down, in that cold black heart of yours, You were curious, weren't you? You wanted to know if I was right. You wanted to know if there was a way out of the dark. Volt's hand trembled. The violet light of the blade flickered. Silence. He lunged. Cyprian didn't move. He didn't have the strength left to dodge. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. The sound of clashing metal echoed through the sphere. Cyprian opened his eyes to see Xylia standing over him, her gravity lance locked against her father's blade. Her war mask was gone, and her face was a map of absolute resolve. "Enough, father," she said, her voice vibrating with the power of the spirit he had seen in the loom. "The vengeance is over. The hegemony is not a weapon. It is a people, and we choose to live." Volt roared, throwing his full weight against her. "You are weak. You are corrupted." "I am an Archon," Xylia countered, her lance pulsing with a brilliant golden light, the color of the resonator bloom. "And I am ordering you to stand down." As father and daughter engaged in a final, desperate duel on the narrow catwalk above the singularity, Cyprian dragged himself back to the terminal. Every movement was a struggle against the gravity of the void. His vision was almost gone now, replaced by a swirling nebula of data and memories. He reached the final interface. One last gate. The ghost signal from Earth arrived. It hit the dirge's arrays with the force of a digital tidal wave. "Fire," the signal commanded. "Exterminate." Cyprian's hand hovered over the execute command. He looked up at Xylia, who was pinned against the railing by Volt's blade. He looked at the singularity, the heart of a god. He didn't fire the weapon at Earth. He fired himself at the galaxy. The world vanished in a roar of violet and gold. The bridge of the obsidian dirge was a scene of controlled chaos. Violet sparks showered from overhead conduits as the ship's AI struggled to process the massive neural surge coming from the reactor core. Officers were shouting. Tactical displays were flickering through 1,000 years of history in a matter of seconds, and the very air seemed to vibrate with a high-pitched, melodic ringing. Reen stood at the center of the bridge, his lance held ready as he watched the monitor that displayed the core chamber. He saw the flash of golden light. He saw the singularity pulse with an impossible warm amber glow. "What did he do?" Reen whispered, his voice full of a dread he couldn't name. "He's broadcasting," a technician cried, her fingers trembling as she tried to stabilize the comm arrays. "He's not targeting Earth. He's targeting every receiver in the system, every ship, every station, every neural link on Cryos Prime. He's using the dirge as a megaphone." On the main view screen, the image of the blue-green Earth was suddenly replaced by a montage of memories. It wasn't just a video. It was a sensory immersion. Everyone on the bridge, everyone in the fleet, suddenly felt the warmth of a human sun. They felt the scent of rain on dry soil. They felt the crushing weight of grief for a lost mother, and the frantic, desperate hope of a man trying to fix a broken coffee machine. They felt Cyprian Voss, and then they felt the betrayal. The broadcast shifted, showing the hidden facility on the moon. It showed the human faces of the Aegis group, their eyes cold with the same militaristic fervor as High Prefect Volt. It showed their tactical plans, their communications with Volt's agents, their callous disregard for the billions of lives they were willing to sacrifice for the sake of purity. The wedge was exposed. A collective gasp echoed through the bridge. The warriors of the hegemony, who had been raised to believe that humans were a chaotic, untrustworthy threat, were suddenly confronted with the reality of their own reflection. They saw that the enemy wasn't a species, it was an ideology, a system of fear that existed on both sides of the stars. Ambassador Miller, who had been brought to the bridge under guard, stared at the screen in horror. That is General Vance. He's the head of the Lunar Defense Command. I had no idea. He's the one who sent the signal, Reen said, his voice cold. He's the one who wanted us to kill you. The broadcast continued, but the imagery began to fray. The amber light was being choked by the black static of the singularity. In the core chamber, the feedback was reaching a critical level. "Archon!" Reen shouted into the comms. "Xylia, do you read me? The core is going to collapse. You have to get him out of there." Down in the sphere, the duel had stopped. Volt stood frozen, his blade lowered, his eyes fixed on the holographic displays that were manifesting in the air around them. He was seeing the truth of his partnership with the Aegis Group. He was seeing that he hadn't been a conqueror. He had been a puppet. They played me, Volt whispered, his voice cracking. They used the hegemony as a blunt instrument for their own civil war. No, Father, Xylia said, her breathing heavy. You played yourself. You were so blinded by your need for an enemy that you invited one into our very house. She turned away from him and ran toward the terminal, where Cyprian lay slumped over the controls. The blue light was fading from his body, replaced by a terrifying, deathly pallor. Cyprian, she cried, pulling him into her arms. Stop it! It's enough! They've seen the truth! Cyprian's eyes flickered open. They were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide. He looked at her, but it was clear he was seeing something far beyond the chamber. System. Stabilized, he wheezed. Interface. Complete. He reached out a shaking hand, his fingers stained with blood, and touched her cheek. His touch was cold, the cold of the void. Did it work? It worked, Xylia sobbed, her tears falling onto his gray skin. The fleet is standing down. The elders are calling for a ceasefire. You saved them, Cyprian. You fixed it. A small, triumphant smile touched his lips. 5,000 credits, he whispered. Tell Miller. No discounts. His eyes closed, and his hand slipped from her face. Cyprian! Xylia screamed, the sound echoing through the mile-wide sphere. Suddenly, the bridge was plunged into darkness. The singularity let out a final discordant note, and then vanished, the graviton emitters powering down in a sequence of heavy, metallic thuds. The obsidian dirge, the most powerful warship in the galaxy, drifted silent and dark in the orbit of Cryos Prime. Archon, Reen's voice came through the emergency speakers. We've lost primary power. The life support is on reserves. We need to evac the core now. Xylia didn't move. She held Cyprian's limp body against her chest, her forehead pressed against his. She didn't feel like an Archon. She didn't feel like a warrior. She felt like a woman who had finally found her heart, only to watch it flatline in her arms. But then, a faint pulse of light emanated from the crystalline shards orbiting the dead singularity. One by one, the units began to glow, with a soft, steady amber, the same light that had filled the ancestral loom. He is not gone, the voices whispered, no longer a chorus of millions, but a single harmonious chord. He is woven. Xylia looked up. She saw the shards descending, circling around her and Cyprian like a swarm of protective fireflies. They were pouring their stored energy back into the terminal, back into the conduits, back into the broken man in her arms. The ancestors, she whispered. They are returning the gift. On the bridge, the technicians stared at their monitors in disbelief. The neural lattice is regenerating, the head officer cried. It's bypassing the hardware. The ship it's healing itself. It wasn't just the ship. On Earth, in the hidden lunar base, the Aegis Group was finding their systems locked. Every terminal, every drone, every weapon was being seized by a massive benevolent AI force, the combined consciousness of the Cryosian ancestors and the human engineer who had shown them the way. The war that had been 10,000 years in the making was over before the first shot could be fired. 3 hours later, the obsidian dirge relit its engines. But the glow was no longer violet. It was the warm, golden light of a setting sun. Xylia stood on the bridge, her armor removed, her silver tattoos glowing softly. Beside her, in a specialized medical chair, Cyprian Voss sat wrapped in thick blankets. He was pale and his hands were still bandaged, but he was alive. You're a terrible patient, Xylia said, her voice filled with a warmth that made the bridge crew smile. You've tried to get out of that chair 6 times in the last hour. I have a job to do, Cyprian grumbled, though he lacked the strength to actually move. The coffee machine on the bridge is making a high-pitched whistling sound. It's driving me crazy. It's clearly a faulty pressure valve. We will fix the coffee machine later, Cyprian, Xylia said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. For now, you will rest. She turned to the main view screen. The Terrasol diplomatic shuttle was approaching, escorted by a wing of Cryosian interceptors. For the first time in history, the two species were flying in formation. What happens now? Cyprian asked, his eyes following the ships. Now, Xylia said, we deal with the survivors. Volt will face the elders. Vance will face your coalition's courts. And we will begin the great softening. Cyprian chuckled, the sound turning into a cough. I like the sound of that. He looked at her, his hazel eyes clear and bright. You know, Archon, I think I'm going to like being a soul light. It's much better than being a janitor. You were never a janitor, Cyprian, Xylia said, taking his hand. You were the interface. As the shuttle docked and the peace talks truly began, not out of fear, but out of a shared understanding of their own fragility, Cyprian Voss closed his eyes. He had fixed the biggest system of them all. He had found the human element in the heart of a war machine, and in doing so, he had saved two worlds from themselves. The cost had been high, and the scars would remain, but as the golden light of the dirge filled the bridge, he knew it was worth every credit. Actually, he thought, drifting off to sleep, make it 10,000 credits, and no discounts for the Archon. The system was finally in harmony. The silence that occupied the bridge of the obsidian dirge was no longer the heavy, suffocating vacuum of the destroyers. It was a textured quiet, like the hum of a well-oiled engine running at a low idle. The violet emergency lights had been replaced by a soft amber luminescence that seemed to emanate directly from the walls. The ship felt less like a cage and more like a living skin. Cyprian Voss sat in a salvage pilot's chair, his feet propped up on a console that had, until an hour ago, been part of a genocide array. He was wrapped in 3 layers of thermal blankets, clutching a steaming mug of that sun-grain infusion Xylia had given him. His hands were still trembling, a fine rhythmic shudder that he suspected would be his new normal for a while. The doctors called it neural echo. Cyprian just called it the price of admission. You look like a pile of scrap that's been through a trash compactor twice, Grounder, Reen said, leaning against the doorframe. The massive warrior had a bandage across his indigo cheek, and his armor was missing a shoulder plate, but his eyes were clear. I feel like a pile of scrap that's been through a trash compactor 3 times, actually, Cyprian wheezed, taking a sip of the warm liquid. Any word from the surface? Or did the elders decide that forgiving everyone was a bit too much of a shock for their delicate systems? Reen walked over, his heavy boots making a clacking sound that felt comforting rather than threatening. The Council of Elders is in emergency session. It's a total cluster pay down there. Volt's hardliners are trying to spin the Soul Light incident as a mass hallucination, but the spirit of the loom isn't playing along. The ancestors are talking, Cyprian. For the first time in 30 centuries, they aren't just reciting battle statistics. They're telling stories. Stories? Cyprian asked, his eyebrows shooting up. Yeah, about gardens, about music, about the way the light hits the southern valleys during the Great Thaw. Reen shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his face. The military brass is losing their minds. They don't know how to command a fleet that is currently crying over forgotten poetry. Good, Cyprian muttered. Maybe they'll be too busy blowing their noses to blow up any planets. The door to the bridge hissed open, and Xylia walked in. She was dressed in the white robes of an Archon regent, her silver tattoos glowing with a steady, peaceful light. She didn't look like a warrior anymore. She looked like the interface she had been born to be. Ambassador Miller has been contacted, she said, her voice resonant and clear. The Terrasol Coalition has confirmed the arrest of General Vance and 12 other members of the Aegis Group. They found the remote trigger device in a sub-level of the lunar base. Cyprian let out a long, shaky breath. Thank God. I was worried they'd pull some deniability card and claim it was all a Creation glitch. They tried, Xylia admitted, sitting on the edge of his console. But your broadcast didn't just hit the military bands, Cyprian. It hit the civilian networks. People on Earth saw what we saw. They felt what we felt. It's hard to manufacture a war when both sides are looking at the same mirror and seeing their own reflection. She reached out and took his mug, setting it aside so she could hold his bandaged hands. You've changed the system, Cyprian. Not just the ship, but the logic of the entire hegemony. My people, we are waking up from a very long, very cold sleep. Cyprian looked at her, his hazel eyes softening. And you? Are you awake? Xylia looked at the view screen, where the blue-green Earth was now framed by a wing of Cryosian research vessels. I am learning to be. It is frightening. The numbness was easier. But this warmth is better. She leaned in, her forehead pressing against his. Reen cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling, pretending to be very interested in a flickering light fixture. Archon, the Shield Sworn said, his voice a low rumble. The Elders are requesting your presence on Cryos Prime. They want to discuss the Great Softening, and they want the human there too, as a witness. I'm not a witness, Cyprian grumbled, though he didn't pull away from Xylia. I'm an engineer, and right now the only system I'm interested in witnessing is a bed with 4 pillows and a blanket that doesn't try to sync with my brainwaves. You will have your rest soon, Cyprian, Xylia whispered, but first we must finish the vow. The trip to the surface was a victory lap that Cyprian was too tired to fully enjoy. Thousands of ice bloods, the workers from the coolant tunnels, had gathered at the landing pads, their blue faces turned upward, watching the golden ship descend. They weren't cheering with the rhythmic, military cadence of the warriors. They were singing, a low, haunting melody that Cyprian recognized from his time in the loom. It was the song of the resonator bloom. As they walked through the citadel, the warriors they passed didn't reach for their lances. They stood at a respectful attention, their starlight eyes following the human in the orange coveralls. They saw a man who had faced the destroyers and offered them a hug. They saw a strength they didn't understand, but could no longer ignore. In the council chamber, High Prefect Volt stood in chains of obsidian glass. He looked older, smaller, his indigo skin graying at the edges. He looked at Cyprian, not with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying confusion. You broke us, Volt said, his voice a dry rattle. You broke the blade. I didn't break it, Volt, Cyprian said, standing before the elders. I just showed you that you were using a scalpel to hammer in a nail. You were so busy sharpening yourselves that you forgot what you were trying to protect in the first place. The eldest of the elders, the woman with skin like glass, nodded slowly. The human speaks the truth of the ancestors. The hegemony was founded to preserve our people, not to consume the galaxy. We have lost our way in the dark. She looked at Xylia. Archon Xylia, the council hereby ratifies the soul binding. You are bound to the human Ethan Cole. Cyprian, he corrected gently. Cyprian Voss, the elder continued, a faint smile on her translucent face. May your union be the interface through which our people learn to feel again. As they left the chamber, the great softening began in earnest. The first order of business was the deconstruction of the obsidian dirge's weapon arrays. It wasn't a military decree, it was a collective effort. Cryosian technicians worked side by side with Earth engineers, who had been brought in under the new peace protocol. Cyprian stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city, watching a group of human engineers showing a Cryosian squad how to calibrate a water purification system without using kinetic force. Look at that, Cyprian said, pointing a bandaged finger. That's 100 years of trade negotiations happening in about 5 minutes because someone realized that thirst doesn't have a species. Xylia stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. It is a start, she said, a fragile one. Systems are always fragile at the beginning, Xylia, Cyprian said, leaning his head back against her. That's why you have to keep an eye on the pressure valves. But as long as the interface holds, the machine keeps running. He looked out at the triple suns of Cryos Delta, their light reflecting off the crystalline spires of the city. For the first time in his 32 years, Cyprian Voss didn't feel like a glitch in the system. He felt like the one thing he had always wanted to be, the glue. The Grand Plaza of Cryos Prime was no longer a parade ground for the display of military might. Under the light of the 3 suns, it had been transformed into a massive open-air laboratory and cultural exchange. Stalls had been erected where human diplomats traded packets of heirloom seeds for Cryosian thermal crystals. Children, the blue-skinned Cryosian young and the smaller human colonists, ran between the pillars of the citadel, playing games that involved more laughter than tactical maneuvers. Cyprian Voss walked through the crowd, his orange coveralls now replaced by a tunic of deep indigo silk, a gift from the Council of Elders. He still moved with a slight limp, and his hands had a permanent, subtle tremor, but his face had lost the haggard, haunted look of the arena. He was carrying a toolbox, an old, battered, human-made toolbox. "Where are you going so light?" a voice called out. Cyprian turned to see Reen sitting at a table with Ambassador Miller. The two of them were sharing a platter of sun grains and what looked suspiciously like Earth-made jerky. "The coffee machine in the new trade embassy is making that whistling sound again," Cyprian said, hefting the toolbox. "I told the interns not to override the thermal sink, but did they listen? No. They're humans. They think more power is the answer to everything." "You're a hero of two worlds, Cyprian," Miller said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "You shouldn't be fixing coffee makers. You should be in the high-level strategy meetings." Cyprian snorted. "I've been to your strategy meetings, Ambassador. They're just fancy ways of driving wedges. I'd rather fix a valve. At least when a valve works, people get their caffeine. That's a real contribution to peace." He continued his walk, stopping occasionally to show a Kryosian technician how to use a magnetic calibrator or to answer a curious child's question about why his skin was so soft. Each interaction was a small stitch in the fabric of a new society. He reached the embassy and made his way to the break room. The coffee machine was indeed whistling, a high-pitched, desperate sound that reminded him of the vengeance. He set his toolbox down and opened the side panel. "Need a hand?" Xylia was leaning against the doorframe, watching him with a look of quiet amusement. She had traded her Archon's robes for a practical tunic and trousers, her silver tattoos catching the afternoon light. "I've got it," Cyprian said, though he didn't stop her when she walked over and held the light for him. "It's just a clogged intake. Someone used too much spirit grain and didn't clean the filter." "Typical," Xylia said, her voice warm. "They want the energy, but they don't want to do the maintenance." "Exactly," Cyprian muttered, his fingers moving with practiced ease despite the tremor. He pulled out the clogged filter, rinsed it in the sink, and snapped it back into place. He adjusted the pressure dial, his eyes narrowing in concentration. Then he pressed the start button. The machine let out a low, steady hum. A moment later, the scent of fresh coffee filled the room. "Perfect," Cyprian said, pouring 2 mugs. He handed one to Xylia. "To the great softening." "To the interface," she replied, touching her mug to his. They walked out onto the embassy balcony, looking out over the city. The obsidian dirge was still in orbit, but it was no longer a black spike of dread. It had been painted a brilliant, reflective white, and its singularity core was now being used to power the Dyson ring, providing clean, limitless energy for the entire system. Cyprian took a long sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth settle into his bones. He looked at his hands. The scars from the arena, the burns from the dirge's terminal. They were the marks of a man who had been through the fire, but they were also the marks of a man who had chosen to build something in the ashes. "I spent most of my life thinking that being an engineer was about the machines. I thought that if I could just understand the way the gears turned and the electricity flowed, I could stay safe in my little box of logic. I thought that people were the static, the unpredictable, messy interference that made the system fail. I ran away from the PSYOP units because I didn't want to be the one driving the wedges anymore. But I didn't realize that by hiding in the plumbing, I was just letting the wedges be driven by someone else. This journey, this crazy, terrifying dance with a blue warrior princess, it taught me that the most important systems aren't made of carbon fiber or quantum code. They're made of us. We are the conduits, we are the filters. And when we get clogged with fear and resentment, the whole galaxy starts to whistle like a kettle about to explode. I used to think a hug was just a gesture, a primitive human thing. Now I know it's the ultimate bypass. It's a way to say, I see the person behind the armor, and I choose the connection over the conflict. I'm still a repairman, I guess, but I've realized that you can't fix a world with a wrench. You fix it by being the interface, by being the glue that holds the broken bits together long enough for them to heal. And honestly, it's the hardest job I've ever had, but the view from the balcony, it's worth every scorched synapse. Cyprian set his mug down on the railing and turned to Xylia. She was watching him, her starlight eyes full of a depth he was still learning to navigate. I was thinking about the wedge today, Xylia, he said softly. Volt and Vance. They were so sure that the only way to be strong was to be alone, to be hard, to be a blade. And they were wrong, she said, her hand finding his. The blade only exists to serve the hand, and the hand only exists to serve the heart. Cyprian nodded. It makes me wonder about all the other wedges out there. Not just between planets, but between people. In our own lives, he looked out at the three suns, then back at the readers of his story, his voice a gentle, thoughtful query. I spent years carrying my fear like a shield, only to realize it was actually a wall. I wonder, what are the wedges in your own world that you've been letting grow? Is there someone you've been treating like a broken machine instead of a person, simply because it was easier than trying to understand their static? What would happen if, just for a moment, you stepped inside their guard and offered an interface instead of a defense? Xylia leaned her head against his shoulder, her silver tattoos pulsing in time with the steady, harmonious hum of the city below. Come, she whispered. The suns are setting, and we have a lot of work to do tomorrow. Cyprian Voss picked up his toolbox, the old metal clanking with a sound that was finally, perfectly, in sync with the universe. He didn't need to be a champion. He just needed to be the guy who fixed things.